Alyssa before we start. She's been a technical writer for more than a decade and with a specialty in open source software. Currently, she works as a technical writer for Salt Project and is one of PyPI's 1% most downloaded software packages. Her favorite hobby is to volunteer, and she aspires to be a super connector for the community she belongs to. And she clocks out at the end of the day. She spends many evenings volunteering as a community manager at Good Dogs Project. She loves connecting with 75 plus technical writers in that community who came from every part of the world to improve documentation in open source software and beyond. She currently lives at the foot of the majestic mountains of Utah. I'm jealous. With her husband and kids. When she's not volunteering, she likes collecting vinyl records, checking out new restaurants, or seeing the latest indie flick with her community film club, the Citizens of Kane. Thank you very much for today, Alyssa. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Happy to speak with you. I really liked the icebreaker question about what do you do to unwind after work. And as you can see from my bio here, my favorite way is to volunteer at open source. So that's kind of how I unwind. I still see your slide. There we go. I was just going to say I need to share my slide deck now. Okay, well, let's kick things off. Okay. So again, thank you for the warm welcome. I'm very grateful to Frontend Queens for this opportunity to speak with you. My presentation today is going to give you an introduction to open source software. I've spent about 5 years working in open source, both for my day job at Salt Project and in my personal life. And I really love open source. I personally spend a lot of time thinking and worrying about the health of open source in general. And with that in mind, my goal is to teach you a tiny bit about what open source is and hopefully inspire you and empower you to contribute to open source yourself. So since we're speaking to a pretty broad audience right now, I figured it could be good to give some basic information about open source for anyone in the audience who isn't already familiar with it. So we'll start there. Open source software is software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. In closed source software, or what we typically call commercial software or proprietary software, the software is part of a product, and the source code is owned and controlled by a private company. So in order to read or contribute to that code, you have to be an employee of that company. Makes sense, of course. But in open source, it's not usually called a product. It's typically called a project. And the word project can refer to both the tool being created and the organization that creates the tool. In open source, the software is public, which means that anyone can read the source code. And usually these projects are open to accepting contributions from pretty much anyone. Of course, in commercial software, in order to use the software, you have to be a paying customer with an active license. But in open source, anyone can use open source software, usually for free, as long as they're following the software license agreement. And there's generally a variety of open source software licenses used by most open source projects, with the MIT open source license being the most popular. All right, well, might also help to be aware that open source also uses a few unique terms that you might not personally hear every day, but they're pretty easy to understand once you see how they equate to terms you're probably, someone needs, okay, thank you, that was distracting, apologies. Okay, but they're easy to understand once you see how they equate to terms you probably do hear working for a software company. So for example, instead of a system architect in open source, the person who originally created the project or leads the team is usually called the project author or owner. And instead of team leads, those people are usually called core maintainers in open source. Core maintainers are typically the most important or senior people in the project who control which contributions get accepted and also who help govern the community. Instead of having all the individual titles or roles or specializations that you see inside of commercial software teams, In open source, typically everyone is just called a contributor. It's very flat and democratic that way. Another thing you'll find, instead of calling people who use your software the users or the customers, in open source, you usually call them community members. Now, be aware that the term community is very expansive and generally refers to everyone. That includes users, contributors, and maintainers. At the end of the day, they're all community members. Another key difference comes in the culture of open source. Probably one of the big differences is that open source projects have no company ownership. Uh, Sorry, got to mute somebody else there too. Rather than being owned by a single company in open source, projects are owned collectively by the community, or the project might be part of a nonprofit foundation. A lot of projects, in fact, go to great lengths to ensure that no one company has a controlling stake in how the project is run, so that they can ensure that it stays free and open to the public. Another one of my favorite things about open source culture is that they have a democratic governance model. Open source projects tend to be very transparent and open about their decision-making processes. And they tend to be flatter organizations where no one is fully in charge the way the CEO or your manager is in charge at work. Instead, open source projects tend to be duocracies, where the people who do the most work and have the most knowledge about the project participate in making the decisions. And then decisions are usually based on what's best for the community and the project, as opposed to what's best for a specific company. Now, looking in on it at a more individual level, another feature of open source software is that there are no managers or titles. Again, everyone is simply a contributor. And going along with that, most contributors are usually part-time volunteers. Most people who work in open source are not full-time employees. That means that contributors to a project will have to balance the time that they spend on the project with competing priorities in their day job, their personal life, or their health that might impact their availability to work on the project. So that often means that you have to be patient and expect work to get done on a slightly slower timescale than at a company. So now that you know some of the ways in which open source is different from commercial software, let's talk about my favorite part, which is why open source is so beneficial to the world. Okay, so here's a fun fact. Did you know that an estimated 70 to 90% of modern software solutions are comprised of open source software in some part? That estimate comes from the Linux Foundation in a study they did in 2022. Even software that you pay for often has some sort of open source component or is built on top of open source technologies in some way. So in that respect, open source software really does power a lot of the modern technology industry and has a big impact on the world economy. But let's unpack that number just a little bit. It's kind of mind-blowing to think that open source software can power that much of the world's technology without anyone even realizing it most of the time. A lot of times, open source software operates beautifully and elegantly, just as expected, hidden in the background of most software applications. In fact, sometimes it operates so efficiently in the background that we forget about it until one day when it maybe stops working and draws our attention to just how important and crucial this underlying technology really is. So to illustrate this, I'd like to tell a true story about the day open source broke the internet. On this screen, you'll see 11 lines of simple and unremarkable code. This is from a tiny package called LeftPad, and it had a very simple, humble, and basic function. It was just supposed to write justify your text. It doesn't seem like a big deal, right? But this little package one day caused most of the internet to go down for about 3 hours in 2016. And that's all because of how fundamental and interconnected the world of open source software is. So what happened? Well, this little library called LeftPad was just part of the underlying packages for several other large NPM applications, such as Babel, a JavaScript compiler that is downloaded on average about 11 million times per week. Some of you might have Babel and know that, since we're talking to front-end developers. So one day in 2016, the author of LeftPad, whose name was Azur Kokulu, got upset over a package naming dispute with a commercial entity who wanted to use the same package name that Azur had used for his open source package. After the company threatened to take legal action against him and NPM intervened on behalf of the company, that's when things got a little interesting. So you see, Azur had a long history of contributing to NPM as an open source contributor. He had written and hosted over 270 packages through the site, all of which were open source. That means that his packages had been written into tens of thousands of programs, and those programs had been written into tens of thousands of programs. So when Azure decided to pull all of his code from the NPM platform without warning, you can guess what happened. He broke the internet. The journalist Alex Goldman had a nice analogy for why this happened. Think of it like this. Pretend the inventor of screws suddenly decided he doesn't want anyone to use his design anymore. And so he snaps his finger and suddenly all screws vanish out of existence in the world without warning. You can picture what kind of chaos that action would cause. Well, that's what happened with the internet when Azure removed the package for LeftPad. LeftPad was only 11 lines long. It was barely even noticeable, but as it turned out, LeftPad was everywhere. Most notably, it was written into the foundation of React. And so any program built in React immediately began throwing a 404 message. That included juggernauts like Facebook, for example. The disaster was eventually averted when a developer named Cameron Westland stepped in and published a replacement for LeftPad. That solved some of the problems, but not all of them. In order to restore full functionality, NPM took the unprecedented step of restoring Azure's original library without his consent, but bringing the world's internet back online again. And that allowed things to begin returning back to normal. So you can view this story from one perspective, in which you could feel maybe afraid about the alarming interdependencies of open source software that underlie the world's technologies and which make our systems vulnerable and fragile. But I look at it differently. Instead, I see this as a story about a tiny, free open source program that was powering a piece of almost the entire internet, and nobody knew it until it was gone. The coding contributions of this one highly creative, prolific developer named Azure was powering everything. And that's why open source matters to modern software. Open source software gets incorporated into foundational software that is used nearly everywhere to power most software applications and workflows. And yes, it sadly often does go unnoticed and unappreciated and taken for granted until something goes wrong with it. But in those moments where we get a glimpse of just how important open source software is and how it's part of a vast interconnected set of dependencies that form the foundation for software infrastructure and technology. Sorry, a little catch in my throat there. Okay, I lost my mouse. So let's step back from that big epic idea for just a moment and zoom out and look at the overall reach of open source. This slide lists just a few of the most famous or widely used open source technologies, and I'll hit some of the highlights. So the Linux kernel is probably one of the most important open source projects, and it's also one of the earliest. The Linux kernel powers many operating systems. If you're using anything other than a Windows operating system, your operating system is built on the Linux kernel. That's true for your phone as well. It's also worth mentioning that most programming languages and development frameworks are open source. That includes many you've heard of, including JavaScript, Python, the C family of languages, Ruby, and many front-end frameworks for developing web apps like React, which we just mentioned, Django, Vue, and more. Many web and data technologies are also open source. I've listed some applications that many commercial companies use. For example, I included database technologies that my company's products are built on, such as PostgreSQL or MySQL. It also includes most web browsers, including Firefox and the WebKit browser engine, which powers both Safari and Chrome. And lastly, I would toss on a couple of open source cloud native technologies such as Kubernetes, which is what my company's business division has built most of their products on. And that's just using my company, Broadcom, as an example. Most major technical companies have some kind of open source strategy and invest in open source in some way, whether by making direct donations or by paying employees to contribute to or manage these open source communities. And it makes sense if you think about it. Take Facebook, for example. As we mentioned before, Facebook's platform is built on the open source JavaScript framework React. So since React is a business critical technology for Facebook, they've made the decision to pay for several employees who then contribute directly to React. That gives Facebook a certain amount of influence over that technology, and it ensures that React is always meeting their quality and security needs. Again, this makes sense since React is a business critical technology for Facebook. Even the historic antagonist of open source, aka Microsoft, definitely includes open source as part of its business strategy. For example, they own GitHub, which is crucial for open source communities. and they manage the community for Visual Studio Code, which, as I'm sure you know, is a very popular open source code editor. So there's many reasons why tech companies invest in resources in open source. In a report from OpenLogic that came out in 2023, the number one reason most companies gave for investing in open source was to have access to the latest technologies and innovations. Companies also indicate that they like how open source has helped them improve their development velocity. Sorry. In other words, open source improves their work capacity so that they can do more with less. And they invest in open source for a whole host of other reasons, as listed on this slide, including the fact that these technologies are often low cost. So that's some of the reasons why companies care about open source. But what about you and me as individuals? Why should we care about open source as contributors? How can working in open source as unpaid volunteers benefit each of us as individuals? Well, one big reason is that it can have a very real benefit to your career in tech. In a 2023 survey by CNCF, 79% of contributors say that contributing to open source has helped their career in some way. Well, okay, wow, that's really cool. But how specifically does it help you? Let's break that down a little bit. Contributing to open source can help your career in many ways. It can help you, for one, improve your existing skills. If you're good at a particular skill, such as coding or writing or community management, open source can give you an opportunity to improve those skills by giving you practical experience applying those skills. It's almost like having an internship where you gain valuable practical experience solving real world problems, just like you would at a company. But in addition to improving your existing skills, it helps you develop new skills. One of the things I really like about open source is that it gives me a chance to develop new skills that I want to develop. My title at work is as a technical writer. And if I were to suddenly jump in and start doing UX design work or product management work or marketing, I would definitely start getting some weird looks from people and I might even get in trouble. But in open source, I get to do that work all the time. I've had opportunity to do product management, to do user research and design, to write marketing copy, and even to be a human resources manager. And that's because when you work in open source, you have to wear many hats and take on a variety of roles and responsibilities. You begin to develop those skills based on what the project needs, which is something I personally really enjoy. Another thing is that it gives you the opportunity to take on leadership opportunities. Open source always benefits from people who are willing to step up and do the hard work of being a leader or a core maintainer. Through open source, I've learned how to manage both small and large teams at scale in a way that I never would have done at work. It's nice to also practice and develop leadership skills in a low stakes sandbox environment where you can make some mistakes and that's okay. The consequences for making a mistake are usually pretty small in open source. So you just get to learn from your mistakes and improve and get better for the next time you face a similar challenge. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, you get to build your network. Because of the years that I've spent working in open source, I've built a strong professional network of people well beyond my immediate company. And it's not just talking to people, I get to regularly exchange ideas and best practices and work on tasks side by side with professionals working for Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and many other major companies. But most importantly, it gives you a chance to grow your social network of friends too. Contributing to open source has helped me build a network of friends around the world. This is a picture I took with some of my fellow contributors at the Good Docs project when we were able to meet in person in Portland for the first time last year. I've made some lifelong friendships at my project. I've attended the weddings for people that I've met through the project, and I've had people come visit me at my house who I met through the project. And I also know if I were to visit places like Australia or India or Nigeria, Mexico, Japan, or Amsterdam, that I would have friends there who would welcome me and be glad to see me because I work with them all the time and I consider them to be my friends. I've also seen some truly inspiring stories where I've seen people get their first job because they contributed to our project. Probably one of my favorite stories was how I convinced one of my coworkers to come and volunteer at our project. She was looking for an opportunity to mentor somebody. And so my friend, who is a senior UX designer, She decided to mentor someone who came from an underprivileged background and who wanted to one day become a UX designer. These two designers worked together at the Good Docs project, and the senior designer mentored the junior designer for several months. She taught him how to do user research and how to design a mock-up for a tool, and he was able to take that experience and get his first job as an entry-level UX designer at Google 2 years ago. So he now has a successful career and can support his young family, all because of his experience helping out in an open source project. So that's the power of open source. So hopefully I've convinced you that open source is awesome, because it is, and that maybe you want to contribute to an open source project. If that's the case, let's talk about how you can find your first project and get started with your first contribution. So how do you find your first project to contribute to? Well, I recommend you first start by identifying your goals. Take some time and do a little soul searching to discover what you really want to get out of contributing to open source. Do you want to improve a set of skills? Do you want to meet new people? Do you want to contribute to an interesting project? Take some time to think about what you hope to get out of your experience by contributing. For me, I decided I wanted to get experience working in open source because I was hired by a company that began as an open source project. So I wanted to understand a little bit more about the world of open source and how it worked. I was also looking for ways to socialize with more people online back in 2020 when the pandemic started. So for me, my favorite way to socialize is to work on a task with other people. So open source was the perfect opportunity for me to get that kind of socialization. Next, it's a good idea to ask your network to see if they know of any good projects for people in your profession. So if you're a member of a professional community, such as Frontend Queens, it's good to ask some of your fellow members if there are any projects they've heard of that have a good reputation for being healthy and fun to contribute to. For me, I was introduced to the Good Docs project by a professional organization I belong to called Write the Docs, which is a community of people who care about documentation. So I attended an online meetup in the Bay Area where I first heard about the Good Docs project from one of the members who gave a presentation about it. And for me, I was so impressed by that community member that I joined simply because I just wanted to work with her more, and she seemed really cool. So that's why I joined and how I found it. But once you found a project you're interested in, do some window shopping to see if it's the right fit for you. Before you commit to the project, it's okay to lurk a little bit. Take some time to learn a little bit more about the organization. Your goal there should be to assess whether the project feels like it's the right fit for you and whether you get a sense that you could belong and make a meaningful contribution. In other words, you do want to assess the overall health of the project. So to figure out whether a project is healthy or not, one of the first things you should look at is it actively maintained? You want to feel confident that the people working on this project devote sufficient time and energy into maintaining the project over time. So you'll want to ask questions like, is it clear who the project maintainers and leaders are and how to communicate with them? Do the project maintainers regularly respond to issues and pull requests in a timely manner? Or do pull requests sit open and untouched for several months? Do they release regularly or at least consistently? Or has it been a few years since their last release? And ironically, it's still in beta. That's not a good sign. um, you also want to look at the goals and roadmaps. A healthy project should have a clear direction for where they're going in the future and what they want to accomplish in the short and long term. So ask questions like, can you easily determine what the project is working on and where they plan to go next? Are their goals or roadmap publicly available? Is it easy to see what tasks are available to work on by looking at their issues or by attending their meetings? Another thing you want to look at is community governance. Community governance refers to the rules and customs that define who gets to do what in an open source project. So ask questions like, what's the project's governance model and is it documented? How do project members make decisions and do members seem to abide by those decisions? How does the project communicate internally? Does the project have enough communication channels? Can people easily find and use these channels? Are these channels governed by a code of conduct? Next, you want to look at onboarding processes, meaning how easy is it to get started using the tool or joining the community? So ask questions like, my personal favorite, does it have good documentation to get you up and running? Does the project have a contributing guide with clear processes? Does the project welcome contributions of more than one type, like not just coding and development, but also maybe marketing and project management or event planning? And the last thing I want you to think about is the age of the project and where it is in the project lifecycle. This refers to how old the project is and whether it is mature or not. I wanted to include this last bit as kind of like a caveat, as something you should watch for because it might help you to put your assessment into proper context. For example, it's okay if the project doesn't have a lot of contributors if the project is young and brand new, but it maybe wouldn't be a good sign if the project is older and more mature. So if the project is young, that means you should assess it a little bit more leniently and consider it a place where your efforts are probably really needed. For example, when I joined the Good Docs project, it didn't have many of these health markers because it was still relatively new. But today it has these markers because they grew and developed over time, and because I helped them grow and develop over time, as did the other project contributors. So with your help, a project can get better, can become more healthy, and can also grow and develop over time. All right, so after that, you can start by preparing to make your first contribution. Start by learning how they want you to contribute. Every project is a little bit different. Some projects actually don't want contributions, and it's good to know if that's the case. You can learn if they're open to contributions by reading the documentation, specifically their README file and their contributing guidelines. Every project has a slightly different culture or a different way that they want you to contribute. So you need to do a little bit of research to make sure that you're giving them the kinds of contributions that they would like you to give them. Next, you do need to learn about Git, GitLab, and GitHub. Most open source projects use Git, which is a version control technology, and most projects are hosted on GitHub or GitLab. I do need to warn you that learning Git is not easy. It takes a significant investment of time and energy. It is not intuitive. However, there are some great resources online that can help you get started. So plan on it taking a while and requiring some practice. It is nice to be in an open source project where maybe you have somebody to ask advice on Git from. It's easier to learn Git with a friend. So next, look at the project's open issues. In GitHub and GitLab, each project has a list of issues that represent some work that the project would like you to work on. If it hasn't been assigned to someone else, that means you can volunteer to take that issue and work on it, and then open up your first pull request to submit your work. Some projects also label issues as good first issues, which means they're easy for new contributors to pick up and work on. So if they use that label, go ahead and search for some of those issues. Lastly, and most importantly, you need to start cultivating the open source mindset. So let me explain what I mean by that a little bit more. One second. To understand this mindset, you need to understand the tragedy of the commons. One of the things that open source projects always have to guard against is the tragedy of the commons. So now, if you'll permit me to get just a little bit academic here, the tragedy of the commons refers to situations where individuals all have access to a public resource, which is typically called a common. If these individuals choose to act in their own self-interest rather than in the interest of the group as a whole, then they risk depleting the resource and they endanger the commons. So to illustrate this concept, imagine a community that gathers around a bonfire during festivals. Each person is responsible for bringing some logs, and every now and then they need to throw one of their logs onto the bonfire to keep it burning. When enough people contribute regularly, everyone in the community benefits from the warmth and light. Even people who didn't quite bring enough wood can still enjoy and benefit, and that's okay. However, if most individuals refuse to contribute any wood, then the fire starts to dwindle, leaving everyone in the cold and darkness. So in order to avoid the tragedy of the commons, everyone needs to contribute to the common good to the extent that they are able to. And that's very, very true of how open source works. But in open source, instead of everyone needing to contribute logs, it refers instead to people's contributions to the project in the form of time, energy, and output. If one person has to bring all the wood all the time and do all the unpleasant maintenance work for the project all the time, they're going to get burned out and their goodwill is going to be depleted. And when that happens, it endangers the health of the project, which could threaten all the benefits that come with that project. But when we pitch in and help and all do our part as much as each of us has the bandwidth for, the project remains available and sustainable into the future. So, how can you be the kind of contributor who helps open source software thrive and avoid the tragedy of the commons? How can you make sure that you're putting in more to the project than you take from it? Well, you would probably guess that it would be related to the number of contributors that an open source project has. More contributors means more work getting done, right? Well, wrong, actually. Sometimes having a lot of contributors actually makes it more difficult on the project maintainers and increases their stress levels. It increases the coordination costs, the maintenance costs, and it consumes onboarding resources that could probably be spent otherwise. Instead, preventing the tragedy of the commons is actually about the quality of the contributions being made. So in her book, Working in Public, The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software, which, by the way, is one of my all-time favorite books about open source. It is so good, and I refer to it like all the time. Nadia Egbal distinguishes between two types of contributors to open source projects: active contributors and casual contributors. Nadia Egbal says active contributors might look like casual contributors at first, but their motives are different. Active contributors tend to exhibit pro-social attitudes, demonstrating a higher level of motivation to help others. Active contributors who stick around do so not because they successfully made their first contribution, but because they came in with the intent to stick around. An active contributor is often motivated by a desire for community. They enjoy the social aspects of the project, and they want to feel as though they're part of something. She continues, whereas active contributors show interest in adding value to others early on, casual contributors demonstrate an acute personal need at the outset. Casual contributors don't plan on sticking around, and they have the least amount of context regarding the project's processes or norms. It's tempting to attach a host of assumptions to casual contributors, but it's better to simply think of them as self-oriented rather than communally oriented. Active contributors are awesome because they put much more into the project than they take out of it. They make higher quality commits because they have a context for the project. They stay with the community over the long term, and they occupy a position of trust within the community. So do your best to be an active contributor. Learn about the community culture and try to respect it and live by it. As a general rule of thumb, be nice and professional in all your interactions with the community. Help the project maintainers to build a sticky community, meaning people who want to stick around for the long term because it has deeper value to them. Ensure that you have the context to contribute, making sure you get up to speed on the technology and workflows in the project. And then pay it forward by helping to mentor other people who are new. Cultivate a mindset where everyone in the community is trying to support each other in improving our professional skills and growing our professional network. But at the same time, I want to caution you that improving your skills and career prospects should be seen as a positive side benefit of contributing to open source and not the primary purpose. You should want to contribute to the project because you care about what the project is trying to do on some level and because of the friendships that you made there. Also work on helping prevent maintainer burnout. It takes a lot of work from core maintainers to keep a project running. It's tough, often invisible, thankless work that makes all to make all that infrastructure work properly, to make sure that the contributing processes are in a healthy state, that everyone has a meaningful task to work on with adequate community support. So be mindful of the demands that you make and the work that you create for members of the community who serve as maintainers. A question I often ask myself is, if not me, then who? If you feel like the community should do something or take some kind of action, the best way to do that is to open things up to the community for discussion and build community buy-in and alignment for the thing you want to do. Or even better, roll up your sleeves and do some of the initial groundwork yourself. That goes a long way. So that's it for my presentation today. But let me end by giving you some options. If you want to stay in touch with me, you can connect with me on LinkedIn at the address that I've provided here. And I think Ophi is also going to put some of these links in the chat. When you send a LinkedIn request to me, just tell me that you watched my presentation at Frontend Queens. I don't always accept every request I get on LinkedIn, so it helps me to know that you want to connect with me because you met me here. You also can check out my professional portfolio at the address that I've listed there. My portfolio contains some of my work, and it also includes a blog where I post about once a month on topics about open source and technical writing, if those topics interest you. Fair warning, I write long blog entries. It's the one place where I can indulge myself and write long things. So they take a while to read. Sorry about that. And lastly, you can join me at the Good Docs project if you're passionate about making open source documentation better. We can use front-end developers, weirdly enough, if you're interested. But you can use this website address to sign up for a Welcome Wagon meeting and get started in our community. Just be aware that if you want to join the community, I recommend joining today or tomorrow, because otherwise you might not get an opportunity to attend a Welcome Wagon meeting until after our upcoming release in June. We kind of stop taking newcomers when we have a release. And so we won't accept new members until July, after we're back from our project break. But if you sign up today, we could make space for you in our Welcome Wagon meetings next week. All right, I believe I'm out of time, and I don't have time for questions unless people want to stay late, unless you would like me to take questions. I used up all the time, so sorry. Would we like questions?
I think we have one question in the chat, which is Ina. Just like at the beginning, she asked if the info would be on README. Ina, could
Sure.
you remind me of the context of the question?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So this is something to be aware of about open source project culture. When you like, one of the key foundational pieces of open source documentation is the project README. That's in all caps, README. Whenever you go to any repository for an open source project, it should have a README file. And if they have good documentation, you could be able to ideally get all of the information that you need from that README file. If they don't have a high quality README file, it will be more challenging to get started with the tool and with the project. So that's why good documentation matters, by the way. And if you want a template for how to write an effective README, that's what we do at the Good Docs project. We provide templates for effective open source documentation. So we provide guidance for that if you want help writing an effective README as well. Did that
Thank
answer
you.
the question?
Yeah, Ina says thank you.
Oh, good, good.
Cool.
Yeah, README and contributing guide, those are the two kind of really foundational pieces of documentation.
Monica asked, what's your best tip for like very beginners who are diving into open source right now?
Yeah, my tip is to really find the right project. Find the project where you feel like it's going to be home. And it takes a while to find that. It took me maybe like 6 months to find a project where I found my home, you know. I was actively searching and looking for a good one. And yeah, so yeah, good question.
Sorry, I don't want to take much of our time, so but many questions people are like popping up in the chat.
I am okay going later, but if other people need to drop because it was only supposed to be 45 minutes, I'm still good to stay.
Oh no, okay, I'm sure everyone is eager to know more. Shirley asked if she would like to know what exactly is your role in the Good Docs project? Like, what do you do?
What do I not do at that project? I wear many, many hats. So I started when the project was maybe, 6 people big, now it's 75 people big. And it's changed over time. The role I like to lead with is that I'm their community manager, but I'm not the only community manager. And if you don't know what a community manager is, they're kind of like your human resources manager at work. But cooler, I think. They're not, you know, I say my dad is a human resource director, so I don't mean to put down his profession, by the way, but I actually think it's really great, human resources. But as a community manager, I'm responsible for maintaining the health of the community, making sure that everybody feels welcome, making sure that they have the correct resources to get them up and running with the project, if need to, mitigating disputes between community members. I haven't had to do that, thankfully, but I'm there. We have that training if we need it. And yeah, mostly just there to make the community a good experience for everyone and to ensure that it's great. That's my primary role, but I also serve as a leader of a few working group leads, and I'm a member of the project steering committee, which makes key decisions for the group.
Thank you. Aina asks, how should she, like someone who contributes to open source, should put that on their resume?
Yeah. So that's good. Different companies will value open source contributions differently. I recommend putting it, if you don't have experience, like job experience, then put it at the top of your resume. Treat it as work experience, list it as an organization that you work for, because it helps to like give you like experience if you don't have any work experience. If you do have work experience, list your actual work experience first, and then put your community service a little bit lower down on your resume. But be aware that different employers will value it differently. Some employers will be like, that's awesome, and that's why we wanted you here. We loved the contributions you made to open source. And others won't value it. So it's up to the employer whether they care about it or not.
Thank you. Liza asks, how do we know when someone is ready to contribute? Like, how does this person knows they're ready to start?
Yeah. So two answers to that. One is like you could work to skill up and try to have your skills ready before joining the project, and that would be nice because you would reduce the burden on the maintainers. Yes, but that being said, as long as you have a pro-social attitude and a passion to be there, and you're willing to work hard and to give the time and energy that the community needs, that's the only thing you really need. You don't need the skills. You can grow those skills in the open source project. The way a lot of open source projects work is they wait to get to know you a little bit, and then once they know you, they'll begin investing in you as a person and giving you mentorship and helping get you up to speed. I do that all the time at my project. People come in with very little technical writing experience, but when I've gotten to know them, I see that they're committed, they want to be here with the project for a long term. Then I say, okay, this person's worth me investing and mentoring in them. And so like a lot of times I'll give a lot of one-on-one mentorship to get them up to skill, to get them the things that they need to be successful, with the hope that they will move into a leadership role, that they will begin taking in a larger role in the community. So it's a tiny risk, and as a maintainer, I have to take that calculated risk. So you want to communicate to the maintainers that I'm worth taking that risk on. I'm worth mentoring because I'm here to stay and I want to make a difference and I believe in the project.
Thank you. I have a question from Maria. She's asking if you could discuss about any of the challenges you faced when you started as a technical writer and how you overcame them.
Yeah. Um, I think that the challenges of being a technical writer as a profession in general, it's hard to be taken seriously sometimes, especially by developers. It's sometimes you can be, depending on the company culture, you can be seen as not as important as the development team. So one of the things you have to do as a technical writer is to change that perception And I think that a lot of what it's weird, like as a technical writer, the vast majority of what I do is relationship building, building goodwill. At least maybe this is me as a person, but this is my strategy is to like, build goodwill with my team to show them that I have the technical expertise to be taken seriously by developers, to show that I care about them as individuals and want to see the group and the team succeed, and making one-on-one personal connections to let them know that I'm here and a member of their team. I think another key piece of elevating the status of docs to be equaled with development is to use a docs as code approach where it's possible, which is use the same tools for development that developers use, so that they see documentation as an integral part of the development process and having equal status with the code.
Thank you. That's great. People, right? uh, Stacy asks, where do we go first to find good open source projects to contribute to?
That's tough. I don't have a great answer for that because I found my one true project. But again, I would recommend asking around and maybe doing some Google searches, and seeing which projects have some good reputations. That's a more complicated question, and it's very individual. It would really kind of depend on the person. That could be good, Lisa. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Could be good.
Oh, thank you. Lisa says she heard of good first issues. Is that a good?
Yeah, I haven't tried it, but yeah, I would trust what Lisa says. Why not check it out? There's no harm in checking it out, right? And that's how it is. Like, there's no harm in at least lurking and figuring out how, and attending presentations like this. Also, usually people have connections, and you find projects by the people who are promoting them.